Hey guys, Jerry Berg, the poor historian here, and I have the house to myself tonight. Daughter's asleep, wife is out drinking with a friend, so I thought I would do a little bit of drinking myself tonight. I've got myself a little bit of whiskey in order to get myself in the spirit of, of a topic that I've been thinking about for quite some time, and that would be the role of hand-to-hand combat during the American Civil War. Now, this is a very dangerous thing to do. You should only let trained professionals ever drink and educate at the same time. So, the truth of the matter is, my reenacting group has a subsection that goes to various Civil War reenactments and conducts our HEMA-based combat show, focusing on combat that you would see in the American Civil War. We have bayonet sparring, we've got knife combat, and of course lots and lots of saber work. However, doing so, I always dig way too deep into these things when I try to recreate them. And I found that there seems to be a weird stigma among armchair historians about the role of hand-to-hand combat during the American Civil War. If you were to ask the average Civil War reenactor, or not even just a reenactor, a standard historian, or even a scholarly historian, if you were to ask them what role hand-to-hand combat had in the Civil War, most of them would say it did not have a very big role at all. The minority of battles were won with hand-to-hand combat, and really it came down to fighting with guns, with the battle line. So I really didn't like that idea, automatically downplaying the role of hand-to-hand combat, when in reality you see all sorts of evidence of the role that hand-to-hand combat had. You have bayonet training, you've got saber manuals, lots of accounts of hand-to-hand combat, and of course all of the soldiers, or at least the vast majority of them, were trained in hand-to-hand combat, at least with a bayonet. So my mind was split. Everyone was saying that hand-to-hand combat did not have a big significance, but all this evidence was saying otherwise, so I started digging into it. And I came across, on all these forums and discussion boards, and even quite a few books, you see these historians stating that the bayonet did not, and the saber did not have a big role in combat, based on a study that found that, I believe it was less than 1% of wounds that were treated in hospitals and surgeons' tents during the Civil War were inflicted by a hand-to-hand weapon. That would be bayonets, sabers, knives, or other swords. Or I suppose you can even get into lances and pikes, but we'll get into that in a later video. So that is where the majority of this issue stems from. So I tried to find the origin of this statement, and apparently it comes from a post-war 1870s, Surgeon General's History of Surgical Treatments During the War of Rebellion, or something like that. I'll put the title on the screen. And that is where we get this idea where hand-to-hand combat was unimportant. Now, we're going to, for the moment, assume that the data that was in that book was true, that was in that report is true, that the minority of battlefield wounds that were treated were from hand-to-hand combat, for bayonets or sabers or anything like that. Okay, so we're assuming that's true. Now we can go one of three paths, or we can go all these paths, but there are three paths coming from this. The first one that you see most armchair non-scholarly historians say is, done and done. Hand-to-hand combat had no importance in the Civil War. The end. And therefore you get these issues that you see around here where hand-to-hand combat is downplayed at living history events, in books, in movies. Actually, movies do it a lot because it's cool. But in reality, it's downplayed to the point where you should ignore it. Just don't even have, it doesn't have a role, doesn't have a significance, don't bring it up. I don't like that. So there's two other paths you can go at. One is you can fight against, or kind of work your way around, the results there. And that one would be saying, okay, let's look at this. this is only looking at the results of battlefield wounds. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that only people who were wounded by these things were brought then from the battlefield back to the surgeon's tent to be worked on. Now, if you look at this, and you look at some of these are swords, these are bayonets, these are meant to kill, especially if you are trained. This one would be a cavalry saber, and the whole point would be to ride down the battlefield, and these would be razor sharp. You just hit someone, and it slices them open. Now, Civil War surgeons are notorious for how brutal they were, if you will, ignoring wounds that they thought would be inoperable, if you will. So getting slashed from a saber on horseback is definitely going to cause some serious damage. You can also say saber wounds on the field would cause some serious damage as well. But however, sabers used by infantry, is what I meant, were not very common. Now, what the infantry did use was a bayonet. I've got a replica, but it's hiding in my daughter's room, and I don't want to wake her up right now. But the idea is that bayonet wounds, at the time, if a bayonet were pointing right at you, it wouldn't look straight. It wouldn't look like a knife blade. It would look like a triangle. And the whole point of the triangle is that if you get stabbed with it, you can't just sew it up and let it heal. You get stabbed by a bayonet, you're dead. You cannot heal that wound unless you're very, very lucky. There's no easy way to stitch it up. So the idea that this surgical report is an accurate representation of hand-to-hand combat is definitely skewed, flawed, if you will. The idea behind that is that if you are attacked with a melee weapon, with a bayonet or a saber or a knife, you have a much less chance of being saved or rescued or even had the opportunity to be healed because those wounds were so deadly. You also have to keep in mind that as the soldiers are fighting in their battle lines against each other, if someone gets shot, one of their buddies, they're far away from the enemy, they're just drop down, ow, ow, ow. Their buddy is going to grab them and drag them behind the lines and drag them to the surgeon's tent, or at least somewhere safe for the time being. Now, if you're doing hand-to-hand combat, and you get stabbed or attacked, and you get wounded, there is no line, there is no buddy back there to drag you to safety. You're in the thick of it. So you're very likely going, the buddy who would be saving you is in his own hand-to-hand combat, and you're just left there to die. You don't get that immediate brought to safety, that immediate aspect. And then, of course, this is all of this is hypothetical, but if you're in the thick of it and you're in hand-to-hand combat and your side wins, for example, usually this hand-to-hand combat is fighting over a location, usually a fortification or an artillery position. And so if you're capturing this, you don't want a living opponent next to you. You might put him out of his misery. There might be someone among you who does. Rather than being dragged to safety, they're just left there. So a lot of the soldiers who would get hurt from hand-to-hand combat would be dead, not able to be saved. So that was path 2. And path 3 is essentially ignoring or finding your way around that fact. And this is the one that I love, because when you really dig into this and you really look at how frequent hand-to-hand combat was in the battle records, it's everywhere. Thousands and thousands of soldiers engaged in hand-to-hand combat across these 4 years. It's only 4 years. And there were tons of battles in every single one of those years that had hand-to-hand combat as a part of that battle. Usually a very significant part. Like I said before, either charging over defensive works or charging at artillery positions. Those are very important towards battlefield geography. And so the role, and I'm not saying the number of deaths, I'm saying the role of hand-to-hand combat in those battles was very significant. The other thing to keep in mind is that, and I always say this when I'm reenacting, I say, the way to win a battle is not to kill everybody on the other team, it's to make them scared. Morale has such a significant role in battlefield tactics, especially at this time with linear infantry tactics. So the idea is that you want your side to not be scared, and you want the enemy side to be more scared. And how do you prevent your guys from running away? Well, you build them up in their confidence. You build them up in their strength and their resolve. And one of the best ways to do that, especially for those of us who practice HEMA, you feel strong, you feel confident when you have ability with a sword or a blade, or in this case, a bayonet, with an attached bayonet, essentially a short, heavy spear. So the idea is that maybe hand-to-hand combat didn't have as significant a role in terms of killing everybody on the battlefield, but definitely it had a role in terms of increasing troop morale, which is especially significant during the Civil War when we, the nation, either side, did not have a standing army at the time. They were essentially made up of troops, of recruits, and by the end of the war, very few of them had more than 4 years maximum experience, which is not very much in terms of having linear, professional, trained, standing soldiers. So, where was I going with this? There were a ton of battles that were used in the Civil War that had hand-to-hand combat in the Civil War. So saying that the role of it was insignificant, unimportant to the battle, to the outcome of the war, to the history of the war, is basically an affront to Civil War history as a whole. Now, I know that a lot of people are going to disagree with this because this is the zeitgeist. This is the idea of the time, that hand-to-hand combat was unimportant. Not true. Okay, I'd like to do a little bit. I request that you guys do a little bit of research and a little bit of deeper thinking. When you hit that point where someone says, "Oh, only this amount of battlefield injuries were caused by bayonets and sabers," dig deeper. Go beyond it. Okay? Try to think critically about why they had swords. Why were they issued? These were to NCOs. They also had shorter ones. Oh, that's the same one. I don't know where my musician sword went. They gave them to musicians. They gave them to everybody. You look at the start of the war and people are decked out in knives. There's bayonets on everybody. There's a huge role here, and saying that it's unimportant is not good. Think a little bit deeply about it. I'm sure I'm forgetting something. I might make another video to add on to this, but it looks like we're getting up there in, what is this, 13 minutes or so? I don't want to edit all that. So, until next time, share your thoughts, share your experiences, and hopefully I'll dig a little bit more deeply. I definitely will. I definitely want to cover Confederate pikes during the Civil War, and then maybe go over some of the variety of weapons as well. But that's another video for another time. You guys take care. Post them below, and see you next time.